My name is Patrick Terry, and I'm the President and CEO for the Columbus Council on World Affairs, and we're delighted to have all of you here today talking about a very serious issue and a very global issue. You know, it takes a whole group of people to make something like an opioid crisis go away. It also takes collaboration to make important conversations like today happen. So I wanted to thank our promotional partners, the Adam H. Board, Alcohol, Drug, and Mental Health Board of Franklin County, the Columbus Metropolitan Club, thanks Jane, the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, and the Ohio Opioid Alliance. Please join me in thanking these promotional partners. Yeah. The opioid crisis is one of the largest public health epidemics to hit Ohio homes, affecting thousands of lives. Many of you in the audience are actually on the front lines fighting this issue, working tirelessly to improve the situation. And while the devastating results of this problem fall squarely in Ohio, in Columbus, in our neighborhoods, in our homes, it's not just an Ohio issue or an American issue. This is a global issue, and we are honored to present to you an expert who will shed light on that. And to help me do that, I'd like to welcome to the podium a valuable leader in our own community and across the country. Chad Jester is Vice President of Corporate Citizenship and President of the Nationwide Foundation, where his responsibilities include leading Nationwide's philanthropic investments, associate volunteer and workplace giving programs, education initiatives, and civic engagement. Chad also leads the Nationwide Foundation, which is a private, nonprofit foundation, one of the largest corporate foundations in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Chad Jester.
So thank you, Patrick. So Patrick gets to introduce me, so I get to introduce our keynote speaker, which is a pleasure. Patrick's tone set was right on point. All of us in Central Ohio and our marketplace for many years have been tuned into the opioid epidemic. It's really important we understand what our speaker is going to share with us today, which is the connectivity of Columbus, Ohio, and Ohio to the international marketplace. So Jim Walsh is here with us today. You may have heard and read a little bit about Jim. He has enormous responsibilities with the federal government. He's an Indiana guy. He grew up in the northern part of the state. There's a non-Big Ten school that is somewhere up in that part of the state. I think he might be a fan of theirs, although I don't know why. But we're happy to have him. He's a Midwest guy. So we were just chatting for a few minutes beforehand. I think you'll enjoy his tenor, his demeanor, and his candor today. So let me tell you a little bit about Jim. So he is with the U.S. State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. Was that right on point? That is a mouthful. He's a senior bureau official who's been in that role since December of 2017. He is responsible for the State Department programs and policies combating drug and organized crime around the world, as well as support for law enforcement and the rule of law. His bureau currently manages a portfolio of more than $4 billion in more than 90 countries around the world. Jim was born in northern Indiana, as I mentioned. He's a veteran of the U.S. Army and actually just shared that he started in really combating the influx of drugs to our country after attending West Point, was flying helicopters, and was it in the Bahamas, you mentioned? Yeah, he was in the Bahamas flying helicopters, actually stopping drugs from entering the United States. So he's been at this work with, I'm sure, a lot of passion, which he'll share with us today. He has his master's degree in business administration from Bowie State. So I looked that up. I didn't know where Bowie State was, actually. So part of the University of Maryland system, correct? So obviously talented, experienced, highly capable individual. We're pleased to have you here in Columbus, Jim. Thank you for your service to our country. Jim's been recognized for his service actually with the highest recognition a career service person can receive with the Presidential Meritorious Rank Award, which he received in 2017. So Jim, welcome. Please, a warm round of applause for our guest, Jim Walsh.
Thanks for that kind introduction. I'm going to skip this, and I'm going to sit over there, because the last thing you want is me reading a really great speech my staff drafted, but it'll bore you. that good? Can you guys hear me? All right. Well, really, it's really an honor to be, tone that volume down a little bit. Great honor to be here. As Chad mentioned, I'm a Midwesterner by heart, and even though my career took me to Washington, D.C., I just, over there's a chance to get back to the Midwest. I'm happy to come back. So I'm really thank you for the opportunity to speak here, Patrick. Really appreciate it. So we have a bit of a problem in this country. Call it an epidemic, a crisis, an emergency. I don't care. It's bad, and you guys all know that. In fact, I had a speech full of a bunch of statistics, and the last thing I think you guys want to hear is a guy from Washington, some bureaucrat, telling you how bad it is. You guys are seeing it firsthand, I'm sure. You can't go anywhere in this country without somebody knowing someone that is having an issue with a drug addiction, drug overdose, you name it. It's pretty bad, and fortunately I'm seeing it around the world as well. So it's not just the United States being impacted. Canada has just as much of a crisis, and we're seeing a lot more taking place in Europe, unfortunately. So what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about what we're trying to do overseas. And then I hope to have a chat. So instead of a speech, I have a little 3x5 cards here. Make sure I hit my key points. And then, Patrick, you're going to come up and we're going to have some Q&As and have a good conversation. I really want to get to the heart of what's on your minds. So what I'd really like to do is tell you what our role here is at the State Department. Obviously, we deal with the international side. And so you're probably asking, why is the State Department here talking about a drug problem here in Ohio? It's like, well, as you can imagine, these drugs aren't produced here in Ohio for the most part. They're being used illicitly. They're being produced in China and Mexico, and these traffickers overseas are bringing it to your border and your state, and it's killing our citizens, plain and simple. So if there's not an international role or component to this, then we're missing the mark here. So I take my responsibility pretty seriously, and I'm looking forward to telling you what we're doing about it. So I'd like to talk about, just very briefly, no more than maybe 10 minutes or so, because then you'll be bored, and then I think the Q&A is lots more interesting. Just maybe the trend overseas, the overall trend, what we're seeing, and get you guys an appreciation of what this new trend is all about. Then I'll talk obviously about China and Mexico, which I mentioned, which is where a lot of these drugs are going. Some of the international work, there's a lot of this multilateral work it's pretty critical to our overall strategy. And lastly, maybe talk about looking ahead and what we're thinking about, what's over the horizon, if you will, as we think strategically about this global problem. So let's start talking about the trends. If you think about it, this isn't the first time our country has faced a drug epidemic, a drug crisis. Many in the room were around when we had the 70s first opium crisis with heroin. And then we had another cocaine crack kind of epidemic in the late 80s, early 90s. And you compare those crises to what's happening today. At the peak of those crises, we were losing maybe 3,000 to 4,000 Americans in a year. Now we're at 72,000, according to the CDC. I mean, that's astronomical. So there's got to be something different going on. And you can talk all you want about the prescription pills that got us into this mess. The fact that we had a lot of heroin labs and other places that in Mexico, and the meth labs or whatever got us there. But I think, and a lot of people agree with me, it's because we have these synthetics being added and being mixed in with our heroin that the consumers are using, now with cocaine, or just pressing the pills. And so I'm sure you guys all heard about fentanyl and others. Everybody raise your hand. Everybody heard about fentanyl? Oh, well, only half of you, so maybe I have some explaining to do. So this fentanyl is this really potent synthetic drug, 10,000 times more powerful. The carfentanil is the worst of it, and that's 10,000 times more powerful. It's just this drug that they use to tranquilize elephants. And these criminals figure out a way to kind of mix it somewhere and just give it to humans. Well, guess what happens when you give a couple milligrams of this stuff? It just stops your heart and stops your breathing, and people die. And so the advent of synthetic drugs like fentanyl is a new phenomenon. It's been around for years. But the idea that criminals have now decided that we're going to mix this stuff in there to give these addicts a better high, unfortunately, and they drive towards that. It's being very profitable for them. So profitable that a criminal, someone here in Ohio, someone in Salt Lake City, can go on the dark web, or even the internet. You can go on the internet and Google fentanyl, misspell it, and that's how they kind of get around it. And they'll get a connection with somebody in China or somewhere else. And the next thing you know, they got something going where they're getting this stuff shipped in the mail. And for a $5,000 investment, they can turn that into $1 million. How can you compete with that? So that new phenomenon where it's just so easy because of these 21st century technologies, getting on your smartphone, going to the internet, going to the dark net, using Tor towards that technology to go to the dark net. Then going to the WhatsApp messages capability, and they're all doing this stuff behind and making it very difficult for law enforcement. And this is this new phenomenon that's making it very, very difficult. So we got a lot of work to do, but the good thing is I'm going to tell you a little bit about some things we're doing and a little bit on the law enforcement side, although I'll have to defer to them on what they're doing. That's actually starting to take a crack at making it very difficult for these guys. So let me talk a little bit quickly about starting with China, because I just mentioned that's where a lot of this stuff is coming. And so we've been diplomatically working with the Chinese government for several years now on this particular issue. As a matter of fact, they actually have done some things. They've actually, we asked them to schedule some of these fentanyls because this fentanyl is a drug that you can find in the hospitals, as we all know, for surgery and whatever. It's got an illicit purpose. We said that they had to schedule and control it better, and they have done that. They scheduled up to 143 of these types of fentanyl-type drugs and the precursor chemicals to make this stuff. But that's not good enough, and the reason it's not good enough is because these chemists have figured out a way to get around law enforcement. So the idea is that if you have to have something on the class books that it's a controlled substance for the law enforcement to go after and arrest and make it illegal. Well, they just changed the molecular structure a little bit, and lo and behold, it's now legal. And our chemist in CBP did some analysis in this fentanyl drug. These chemists can figure out 1,900 different ways to create a fentanyl-like substance and get around law enforcement. So our work with China is to say, nope, stop it. If this looks like fentanyl, acts like fentanyl, you need to control it. And so we've been asking them to do that. That's one thing that we've not been successful in. We're going to keep the pressure on. Second, law enforcement. China's not the easiest, most open country, especially when it comes to law enforcement. This is one thing where they have opened the doors, and as a result, and you guys are seeing some of this firsthand. You've heard about that chemist in Massachusetts that was trafficking and supplying a lot of the fentanyl that's coming in Ohio. That was a product of opening those doors, using that good old-fashioned law enforcement techniques to get the intelligence so we can go after some of these bad guys. Let me talk a little bit about Mexico. So if it's not coming directly from China and the United States, it's being shipped right into Mexico. And the cartels, as you guys well know, have a monopoly on the logistical routes here in Ohio. So much so that they're continuing using their same routes where they've trafficked methamphetamines, their traditional heroin, cocaine, all this other really nasty stuff, and it comes into Ohio because they have just a good, well-disciplined supply chain. They are now getting this fentanyl and they're mixing it with the heroin, they're mixing it with cocaine, they're mixing it with methamphetamines. And I'm telling you, I'm going back to my point, this is what's killing so many people. They don't know what's in their heroin. And the stuff is added to it. And it's, as I've just mentioned, a couple kilograms too much, and they're dying. And so the scary part is that this is happening with the professionals. I call the professionals because they do this and they don't want to kill their clients, obviously. What we're really worried about is, as we know, is as this starts proliferating, we have these individuals in Ohio that think they can make $1 million off of a $5,000 investment. They start mixing this stuff in their basement. They don't know what they're doing. And so they're mixing this stuff in. You don't mix it correctly. They press it into a pill. They hand it to the high school kid. And the rest is unfortunately is history. So Mexico is a critical component just because of the logistics and supply chain. We had a recent election there. Down there, President-elect Obrador is taking office in December. You guys may have heard in the press that there's some kind of interesting things he's suggesting, like legalization. We're concerned about that, but that said, I think that we're very, very optimistic, despite what some of the press is saying. I think that this is a government that the U.S. federal government and the state and local and others can work with. He's committed in fighting corruption, and to me, that is the fundamental Achilles heel for us in our law enforcement, is the fact that corruption is so rampant in places like Mexico and elsewhere, that if we can't get after these complicit government officials, complicit bankers, complicit chemists, we're never going to get ahead of finding these cartels. So we made a lot of progress there, and I have some more statistics I can share in the Q&A. I'm starting to go into my 10 minutes. I want to wrap this up. So internationally, there's an international piece, and I go back to the scheduling. Internationally, it's very difficult for us to come together and recognize that this is a global threat. A year ago, I was in Vienna, and I was trying to explain to people, like, you don't want this happening in your shores. This is pretty bad. And they kept on coming, like, well, that's your problem because you guys gave too many people prescription pills. I said, no, that's not the case. Look at what's going on in Canada, look what's going on in the UK. And sure enough, this year, everybody's recognizing, wow, this is a problem. So these synthetic drugs are being mixed, like tramadol and others. They're all being mixed in this heroin and everything. And so now we're starting to see trends in the UK, in Germany. Southeast Asia has had some problems with some weird methamphetamines. And so this new trend is starting to take place. And so the global community is starting to recognize this as a problem. We need the global community, ladies and gentlemen. We need this because we need to start regulating this stuff. We need to start going after the supply. We need to start going after the global demand worldwide. And we got to get this get this under control from a global perspective. So internationally, we're doing a lot of work on the diplomacy side, including scheduling. Lastly, let me finish with looking ahead. I mentioned a little bit about some of the international piece, but the international architecture just isn't there. I just told you about 1,900 fentanyl-like substances. I was in Vienna just in March, and I successfully got the world to control carfentanil, which is a big deal. So now this is all going to be controlled. But it took us a lot of work as an international community just to schedule 11 of them. So you do the math, 1,900, we'll never keep up. So this is something we have to work on to try to address and resolve. Globally on the dark web, the internet, cryptocurrencies, I didn't mention cryptocurrencies, this new phenomenon, as we start we want to export this new technologies that our FBI, our DEA, our CPP, they're starting to figure out how to fight these criminals as they use these new 21st century tools. So we're going to have to look into that. Lastly, detection capabilities. The number one best way to detect this stuff is through canines. We were able to train canines on how to detect this fentanyl, and it's been pretty successful, but that's actually pretty expensive, so we're hoping for new technology to address that. Precursor chemicals is another key component. And lastly, overall policy, and I'll maybe end here. Overall policy, we've learned a lot over the last few years. You've had these conversations about the war on drugs. That was like 30 years ago. Nobody's talking about the war on drugs. But what we are talking about is that if you want to have good drug policy, you want to address this problem, you can't go to just worry about the demand. You can't go to worry about just supply. It has to be a holistic approach. And so we came together in 2016 and unanimously as a world said, we need holistic drug policy. It's not just that you have to have that part of it. It has to be that the professionals are working together. If you don't have, and they're doing this in Ohio. By the way, I just met with Ohio law enforcement and they're doing this. If they're not working with the public health officials, they're not working with other parts of the criminal justice system, we're not figuring out what to do with our prison population so there's not a revolving door, we're never going to get out of this. And that stuff's happening. And that's because overall the policy, we've learned a lot. And so I'll end with a bit of optimism where I think we have figured it out. We've got a lot of lessons learned. It's just going to take us some time to kind of execute that stuff. So I'm going to wrap up there. I probably talked more than 10 minutes, That's what happens when you use 3x5 cards. I apologize, but it would have been much more entertaining if I would have sat and read that speech. Thank you, Patrick.
We love this format, so please don't apologize. This is great. I want to remind the audience that there's no cards on the table. This is how we do our Q&A, and you just go like that, and magically someone comes by and brings it up, and it gets fed into the moderation, which I'll lead sitting next to Deputy Assistant Secretary Walsh. The other thing we do is keep an eye on our Twitter feed, so if you want to do it that way, you can do hashtag AskCCWA and tweet the questions at us, and we look forward to a robust discussion. Before I sit down, Deputy Assistant Secretary, let me ask you to help tell us more. You know, one of the meetings you asked for and set up before you came was with state and local law enforcement. So tell us a little bit more about that meeting, like what are you talking about, and what is our Ohio and Columbus law enforcement doing for us here?
Well, let me start by saying they're doing a lot of great work. So I actually came and wanted to talk to them because I heard that Ohio has some of the best collaboration models out there, and so we want to try to export this. Probably one of the best in the state. And so if you can imagine how complex the supply chain is these days. In the old ways, you know, law enforcement at the local level, they'd arrest, find somebody, they'll capture somebody with some drugs, and then they just go after the prosecution. That's the end of it. Now they've figured out, and they're doing a very good job at it. It's okay. How do we integrate this with DEA? How do we work with the state? How do we figure out the holistic supply chain, and then work it backwards so we actually go after the root cause of where the stuff's coming from? So that's happening right now, and that's really, really encouraging. You guys are very much aware of your 22 pounds of fentanyl that was seized in June. They're working that back. Can't talk about it yet, but they're working how to go after the cartels in Mexico. The other key point is these diversion programs. I'm very intrigued about what's going on in these diversionary programs, and I just came from Chicago, as a matter of fact, yesterday, where they're doing some of the very similar things. And this is my comment. I kind of talked about how the entire criminal justice system has to come together and integrate not just the fact that this individual is being arrested because he broke the law, but going after the root cause of the problem. And the root cause of the problem invariably is because the person just woke up one day and decided to want to use drugs. All kinds of reasons, you know, mental health issues. There's just, you integrate the prostitution problem with that because people are doing prostitution because they need money to, you know, supply their drug habit.
Pain.
It's just painful. And so if you get in front in the early stage, before that individual has to go to the drug courts, lo and behold, that person has some hope. Because as soon as they get in the drug courts and get that arrest and that conviction, how many companies are going to go out there and hire that individual? Whether it's happening or not, they're like, you have a arrest conviction? Next. The person never get a job again. So the fact that the law enforcement is really discovering this and working with public health, working with the courts, working with the prosecutors, working with the public defenders is extremely encouraging.
Got it. You talked about some of the root causes. I mean, it seems like even before it gets to that point, there should be investments made around prevention and mental health issues. Yeah. Do you see any best practices around the country where they're taking steps even earlier than when it reaches law enforcement and judges and others that we might mimic or take suggestions from?
Yeah, maybe I see more on the international because I'm remiss for not getting out and talking.
No,
and talking to folks more here domestically. We actually have created some universal prevention treatment programs, and so we actually have a consortium of 100 countries right now on the international side that are talking about this problem and recognizing that universal prevention, universal treatment plans and curriculum that actually makes sense is a critical way to do this. And so on the prevention side, we've discovered that Nancy Reagan Just Say No, which I remember, and it was like, you know, what did I do when I was in high school at that time? We made fun of it.
Yeah. Right.
But so our high school kids have evolved nowadays, so that the TV ads just ain't going to work. I mean, that'll help. That's not how to get your messaging out. And so there's a lot of lessons learned on the international side. We're talking to folks at the federal level and suggesting some points that we can provide them.
Yeah, I have two teenagers, so it crosses my mind a lot. And they always say to me, Dad, we've already heard, we know a lot more about it than you do. So, don't worry. But I also see them being idiots. I don't know if that comes with being teenagers, but so it's like, okay, fine, you have the info, but sometimes you make bad choices. And the fact that, maybe that bad choice involves that pill that you talked about, that they tell them it's something else. I mean, that's scary as a parent.
It's scary stuff. And that's the part of the messaging. It's like,
Yeah.
hey guys, you may think that you're doing something like a simple like Percocet pill, but it may not be that.
Right. And I appreciate the work that's being done here in Ohio through the Ohio Opioid Alliance and the Denial Ohio program, which, if you haven't checked it out, is worth looking at as citizens here. And congrats on all those who are working on it. I think it's an excellent campaign. So we're starting to get in questions, and I expect that there'll be more.
3x5s, I like that.
3x5. Did they take yours?
No, they're still here.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Did we give you? No. You may need to report that as a government official, as a gift. Those are
I think this is
expensive
below
note
the
cards.
threshold.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
I wanted to ask too, we hear about, so last year President Trump called this a public health crisis.
Yeah.
And then more recently, Secretary of State Pompeo said this is a, quote, truly grave threat. You had an op-ed earlier in the year about working with Mexico and China around controls and enforcement. I want to know what kind of priority this is getting when the president has meetings with China, for example, coming up. So there's a big list. I mean, we hear a lot about tariffs, trade. Where does this fall in the relative rank when the president sits down with the president of China?
Yeah, that's a good question. As you can imagine, the integral workings of the federal government, which is this huge, giant government, and we all put our talking points up to the president and say, this is what we want to, we want you to say when you meet with President Xi. And he did this in October. He had his big meeting with October, and this was up there. So the president went up there, and this is it was a very specific ask to President Xi of doing more on these opioid crisis, getting more controls, and that had a huge impact. And let me tell you, we were not getting a lot of traction, and the Chinese government, they're pretty disciplined. I mean, when it comes down to if their leadership says do something, they will do it. And so it was right up there with the list of trade issues, various economic issues.
Let's turn to some of the questions here. Here's one that says, does the current level of funding to fight this crisis match the need?
I have to say yes, because I don't control the budget.
Got it. Follow-up question. Follow-up question. The opioid crisis has caused doctors to underprescribe or to manage pain.
Yeah.
You state that one of the main drivers is synthetic add-ins. So is prescriber changes working or doing anything towards this issue?
Yeah, so clearly our ONDCP, our Office of National Drug Control Policy, has made this as part of their plan so that we got to get a hold of the prescription pill problem. And in fact, it's working so well that it's been kind of counterproductive. So we had a little bit of a hiccup, and that is as we start pulling these prescription pills off the streets, making it much more difficult to be accessible. Then lo and behold, someone that's addicted, and when you're addicted to opioids, your brain changes. We all know that, right? I mean, we have to change our thinking behind this. This is a substance use disorder. There's no stigmatization behind it. You have to treat this as a health problem. And so they have to somehow feed their addiction. And if that's not available, then they start looking to other things, and that's what's happened. They started looking at heroin and other things, and so the intent was good, but the response on the sequencing maybe it could have been better.
Great, thank you. Please, if you will, questions. Okay, great.
More 3x5 cards.
Yeah, it's going to get long, a long list. But this one came in earlier, and is if the cartels are using the same routes repeatedly, it appears they're acting with perhaps impunity and not concerned with law enforcement action. Could you please address this perception?
Yeah, there's a bit of impunity. I kind of mentioned the complicitness of many government officials. And it's very difficult in Mexico because these cartels have sort of basically owned some of these states for the most part. So you think of the politicians, and I've seen this in the reporting, they have a choice between working with the cartels or losing their family. So it's not a matter of just money, it's a matter of life and death decisions for them. So the corruption aspect is a critical component, and that's why I mentioned my comments about President-elect Obrador. We're very encouraged about him taking on corruption as a key component. I would also say that we have done a lot of other things. I didn't go into detail on Mexico in my opening remarks. But clearly the border's critical, and the new technology we're working on. Right now, if you go to the borders in Mexico, the non-intrusive inspection equipment, it's only hitting a portion of the vehicles that are crossing because there's just such a high volume. We're working on this technology with CBP. We hope to have it launched soon, where it's going to be sort of like a drive-through where folks will just run right through this technology, and it'll be able to better detect some of the contraband that we want to go after. That could be a game changer, and so we're really looking forward to that. We're not there yet. We have to work with CBP to get all the credentials finalized, but the Mexican officials welcome that. They want to partner us with that. They've also done a lot of work on taking down these labs. I mean, we've had close to like 300 labs taken down in the last 3 years. So there's a lot of work done.
So if the substances are coming through or Mexico to the U.S. and we have detection equipment, is that going to solve, is there a lot coming right under our nose and then a lot coming that we don't know where it came through, or help us understand, how does this get in?
To make it very clear, I mean, and this is some of the, as a government, we misled the American people to think we could stop this stuff. I mean, we're never going to be able to stop all the drugs flowing in the United States. But what we can do is certainly disrupt and make the barriers of entry for criminals so high that less criminals are going to want to do this. And so our strategy, our end game is shifting a little bit. And that kind of ties into that question of, okay, where's this stuff coming? I mean, we have to stop we have so many, we have a huge country. We have an open society, so we just can't shut down our borders. And so that's just the realities of it. And so we just have to use these various other tactics to kind of mitigate it.
Got it. Great. Thank you. Let's take another question. Last year, CDC estimates 72,000 deaths from opioid overdose. In 2016, almost 64,000. 2015, over 52,000. These increases, as you mentioned, largely attributed to synthetic opiates. From the international perspective, at what point do we start looking at illicit fentanyl production in China as a form of chemical warfare? And what would be the threshold to do so?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. Is China doing this intentionally? I don't think so, and I'm pretty convinced of that. And the reason I say that is because I don't think it's in their interest to declare warfare with using these chemicals. Granted, they should be doing a lot more, and I think that's some of the messaging you hear from our president to push the pressure on them. But from the diplomacy angle, I'm very familiar with their strategies and what they want to do from a global perspective. They want to be recognized as a global leader. You can't be a global leader if you're complicit in allowing your chemical plants to be shipping these poisons to other countries. And so I think they recognize that this is a problem. We got to keep pressure that maybe should prioritize it a little harder.
I know it was earlier this month, Liz Schreier from the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition did an op-ed in the USA Today talking about how important it is to invest in diplomacy.
Yeah.
And I know that group has both sides of the aisle, it's retired generals, et cetera, who often say that sometimes our best defense and our best security is by investing in development and diplomacy. And so this question relates to that, and I'd like you to comment on this. With no confirmed Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, or for South Asia, who is balancing drug issues with China and with other diplomatic issues like trade and North Korea?
Yeah. Well, it's a bit of a shot at me because I was one of those officials that was in an assistant secretary role, but I was assuming that role despite the fact that it's taking us a long time. So we have an assistant secretary now in my bureau that's taking this issue on from a global perspective. Very thrilled that she's here. Allows me to do a lot more different things. And it's the same thing that's happening in East Asia Pacific and South Central Asia and Western Hemisphere. We have a lot of professional diplomats that I think have rolled up their sleeves and carried it on. With that said, in addition to that, I would also argue that it's not just the State Department, but there's countless of other officials that go over to China and carry these messages. Attorney General Sessions has been over there a few times, Secretary Mnuchin. And lastly, I would argue don't underestimate the power of our ambassador, Ambassador Branstad, and our embassies over there. And that's the nucleus. That's our overseas model where we rely on those ambassadors to push those messages, and he's been doing a great job for us.
Great, thank you. Here's two questions around decriminalization. So I'll ask them sort of as one. Basically, is this a good time to decriminalize? Well, one is about marijuana for recreational use, and the other is around, in general, decriminalizing because it will, for example, diffuse cartels, encourage drug rehab, et cetera. And they mentioned that Portugal has decriminalized all drugs. So maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, as a matter of our drug policy right now, we're not proponents for decriminalization. Granted, I'm going to leave the whole legalization marijuana aspect out of this because I think there's certainly obviously state rights issues. I don't want to get total into that political debate. But I'll throw a few comments out there about marijuana and other decriminalization issues. The marijuana today is not the marijuana that the Woodstock generation was smoking back in the 60s and 70s. The THC level on this marijuana is pretty potent. And I think that narrative is being ignored when we have the conversation about marijuana. What is not being ignored, which I think is encouraging, is exploring the medicinal benefits of this cannabis plant. And I think that as our Petri dish experimentation of our Federalist model has enabled, we've identified that our policies on marijuana probably need to adapt and evolve. And I know that there's discussions being made of how do we look at the fact that new science has evolved and we can look at this plant in a different light. So stay tuned on that one. I think that I would argue that let's allow the science drive our policy versus emotion and those other kind of things. And a broad aspect on decriminalization. I'll go back to the conversations I had with the law enforcement. Law enforcement, community policing has evolved significantly in the United States. I mean, they are the folks on the streets that are first encounters of these people that are having drug addictions, drug problems. If we decriminalize it, we take that connectivity away. And we've evolved from a law enforcement community perspective that it's not 3 strikes and you're out and you go to jail. And that's that diversification program is kind of highlighting. Police officers have recognized that they don't want to be throwing them in jail because one, it's cost prohibitive. They do want to get some information because if we go after the traffickers, we're going to keep the supply coming in. But if we remove the criminal justice system from this issue, we're going to be doing our societies a disservice because right now, as I mentioned, if you treat this just as a public health issue, you treat this as a law enforcement issue, you're missing the opportunity to address the root cause of the problem and figure out how you actually tackle that. So you need to tackle it from a human aspect, but you also have to tackle it as a security and stability aspect as well.
Got it. Let's take this. There's one question I want to ask around the internet, the U.S. Postal Service, and our other shipping services. I mean, that's a whole nother quote unquote border that's being crossed.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Internet.
Yeah,
mail.
internet and mail. Like,
Yeah.
how do we get our hands around that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion around the fact that our mail doesn't have the information that our law enforcement officials need to do their investigations. In fact, there's some legislation on the Hill right now that our president just recently tweeted, encouraging that the Senate kind of take an action upon that. So where I sit, some of this legislation addresses the mail problem. As we know that there's like 300 or so million parcels that come in the United States every year. I mean, the volume is astronomical. And so any type of information that we can have that can lead towards, where this mail came from, and it will be very helpful for our law enforcement officials. Hands down, it's going to be helpful. I must warn, though, it's not a silver bullet, it's not a panacea, because criminals are already starting to figure out how to work around it. But it is a valuable tool that we will need.
I remember some stories also around this, and you mentioned canines being one of the best detectors, that a lot of law enforcement groups are just worried about their officers who come upon something, or the postal workers who, I mean, isn't it just with like a sniff of the one, whatever they say, grain of rice size, and it's killing folks before they even know what it is.
Yeah, so we are exporting that training. I think that our law enforcement officials have exported that training domestically, and so I think that most of our law enforcement folks who have that training. That was one of the things, going back to the canines, the trial and error. This is unfortunately very sad, but that's we lost some canines just because they were sniffing the stuff. They didn't know how to figure it out, and then they died. But we're also, part of that education is to recognize that just because you touch this stuff doesn't mean you're going to die. And so there's certain controls that you obviously have to have, but we also want to mitigate some of those myths that it's not just because it gets on your clothes that you have potential death, but you do have to be careful with this stuff.
Gotcha. Here's another question from the audience. How effective is Project DARE? You're getting a lot of good questions that go probably way beyond your daily thought process. But don't we need to update a model that begins earlier for kids, has more role playing, and is more positive and upbeat?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I kind of was getting into the whole decriminalization argument and DARE is an example where you have the community policing aspect, working with the youth, educating them, keeping them informed, making them aware, having both the community and the law enforcement familiar with what's going on in the streets. So that's a really good, best example. I also think that we're talking a little bit about private sector and how private sector plays a huge role here. And I think there's pockets there, but I think that we need to work in that. And so the private sector messaging is a key component of this. We can always go out and get the word out, but there's inherently going to be some distrust between police and some citizens that they always have to work on, and that's what community policing concepts is all about, is mitigate that trust. And DARE programs are another good example of that. But again, this can't just be the police, the health professionals. It's got to be everyone. Our communities, our schools, private sector in particular. This is a roll up your sleeves, all hands on deck kind of a strategy we need.
And I know it starts at the top. We just got a tweet from President Trump saying, "Das Walsh, go for it." So you're
yeah, very funny.
Yeah. Well, try that. Here's another question from the audience. All right, did that one. Is there a country who has figured this out? And if so, what are they doing that we could export?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
There's some countries that have figured it out, but the model is just so different just because we're such a big country. Singapore, for example. I met with the Singapore Minister of Interior just in March, And they have an example where the training, the education, the perception of how bad drugs are, just like most of their youth just don't start. I mean, it's part of just indoctrinating their culture. It's just not a good, healthy thing to do. Which is why they're kind of reminding me, it's like the American media and social messaging about marijuana there, that they were actually hitting me up on this, is like, our youth are listening to American pop culture, and when you guys say this stuff is illegal, we don't like that. And so they started with very much at the very beginning and starting at the youth, the family, having that conversation right up front to recognize how harmful, how dangerous these illicit drugs are. I mean, right now there's 275 million people around the world that have used drugs. 275 million. That's almost the population of the United States. And so it's a pretty big issue around the world. But I'm a firm believer that, the supply side, I'm a supply side guy. Well, it's got to start with treatment. We got to convince everybody that this is bad. Just if they don't start, then it's not a problem to begin with.
Yeah. Great. Not great, but moving on.
You agree with my point?
I do. Yeah. Thank you. Let's start moving kind of closer to us as individuals. We appreciate your work at the policy level and international level. As we think about our daily lives and our workplaces and our homes as citizens, like what are some of the things we know this is a problem, and sometimes we feel helpless. What kind of things could we do to help feel like we're doing a part in making this issue go away?
Get involved, first and foremost. There's so many different ways you can get involved, and it goes back to the public-private partnership aspect. But there's a lot of community programs out there you can get involved in. Second, having a conversation within your families about this is critical. If we're talking more about this, then I think we're coming up with better solutions. And lastly, as a culture, we're really addressing the fact that there's been a lot of stigmatization related towards this. And that's why so many of the people that are addicted, they choose not to get help. Just because there's no trust there, or they just don't realize that help is available. And it's because of the stigmatization. It's really, it's unfortunate that this crisis has made us recognize that there's some stigmatization around that, because it's unfortunately, as we know, that we've had some other communities, because this is impacting every community, wealthy, non-wealthy. Now we're paying attention, So we got some unfortunate lessons learned there. That it's not just about a race issue or a social economic class issue. It's an American issue.
And a global issue, we hear. Yeah. I wanted to just mention that we're coming to our close here, and so if anyone had any really pressing thing that they wanted, it's your time to get up here. I do want to also mention that part of why we at the Council on World Affairs hosted this was because we wanted to bring together resources in our own community that are addressing this. So what I might ask is, if you think there's something to help answer the question, what can I do? Send an email into one of us on the staff, and our website is columbusworldaffairs.org, where you can see one of us, and say, this is a way people can get involved. And what we'll do in our follow-up email is say, in addition to what Deputy Assistant Secretary said, here are some other ways that you can get involved locally. And so if you do that this week, we would appreciate it. What do you want when you meet with people and you do presentations and you're in the details and you're also talking at different levels? What do you want audiences to walk away remembering or thinking about?
Yeah. Well, let me start by going back to some of your questions about how long is it going to take us to get out of this thing. It took us more than a year to get into this problem. It's going to take us more than a year to get out of it. So I think we got to have patience, and we got to just keep a focus on this and not let the statistics scare us into changing our policy. I think our policies and strategies are right. it's a matter of getting the coordination down. It's a matter of, focusing those resources, breaking down these silos between the law enforcement professionals and our communities, private, public. That's the execution aspect of it. So I'm really excited to be here and just kind of share that. I think we got it right, and you guys are doing a lot of this stuff already. Just what I heard this morning. Lastly, I do want to stress that we even though we have this, we're from Washington here to help kind of joke around here, but we really we get it, in Washington. And we don't need someone to tell us this is your priority. We see our family and friends dying from this stuff as well, and so we're doing everything we can. And I just wanted to kind of share that hopefully you got a little tidbit, a lot of activity taking place on the international side. I have a very small piece in this overall problem. I recognize it's a very small piece, but I think it's an important piece. We don't get this stuff tackled overseas. We don't look ahead, which is why we're actually coming up with a strategy to think about these synthetics, think about what's the next problem on the horizon. Right. If we're not thinking about that, then we're going to be chasing our tails way too much.
Got it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Deputy Assistant Secretary Walsh.
All right. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you. I will also say that at my seat I have a nice gift for our Hoosier here. If he doesn't know what a Buckeye is, when we're done giving you our gift, you will know and
What is a
come
Buckeye?
back. What
If
is
you
a
can tell me
Buckeye?
what a Hoosier is.
Who knows what a Hoosier is?
We
Gotta
don't
be
even know what a
one.
Hoosier is.
There.
Who's there?
Thank you again. We are adjourned. Thanks again. Appreciate it. Let's do it.